I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the articles or references that we're asking you to read for this last week, discussing issues in science and ornithology and birding. And one of the readings is the Wikipedia entry for the ivory-billed woodpecker. We assigned this because I actually looked for a good paper, a good journal article that was accessible and readable, that really outlined the history of the search for this bird. And I really couldn't find one that captured things in the way that I thought would be useful. And I found the Wikipedia page actually to provide sort of the most well-rounded information. But I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And so there's a video accompanying this reading because I actually served on a search team that's just briefly mentioned in this Wikipedia article. And I know a number of the players in the more recent searches for this bird. And so a little bit about the ivory-billed woodpecker. It is considered one of the world's largest woodpeckers, Campephalus principalis, and it was found in the bottomland hardwood forests of the southeastern United States. And so these bottomland, when we talk about bottomlands, we're talking about very low elevations, so flat lands, flooded alluvial plains type forests throughout the southeast. So the Mississippi River drainage, the large rivers that pour into the Gulf of Mexico and into the Atlantic in the southeast have these extensive wetland areas that were seasonally, some of these wetlands areas are always wet, and they have cypress and other trees in there. And then there are slight changes in elevation in these areas that have to do with alluvial deposits that during drier times are above water and during flooded times might be slightly below water. And so these bottomland hard forests were really dynamic ecosystems, full of valuable timber and full of amazing wildlife. And ivory-billed woodpecker was thought to specialize on these large-scale, long-term dynamics that happened in fully functioning bottomland hardwoods. And that is things like hurricanes, large flooding events, even the formation of beaver dams. There would be events that would kill off large trees that tended to need to be slightly dry. And so these ridges would hold trees like oak trees and others that sweet gum was thought to be a preferred tree by the ivory-billed, that they could withstand some seasonal flooding, but they could not be flooded for very long periods of time, otherwise they would die. And so there would be events that would occasionally kill off tracts of old growth trees. And the ivory-billed woodpecker specialized on very recently dead trees along these ridges, or these trees that tended to be higher, slightly higher elevation trees. And what they fed upon were large cerambycid beetle, large bark-dwelling beetle larvae that persist between the bark and the cambium of the tree. And so the beetles will lay their eggs in the bark, and the larvae feed on cambium and then emerge as beetles. And ivory-bills had these large chisel-shaped bills, and they used those chisel-shaped bills to flake away very tightly bound bark off of recently dead trees. They required really large home ranges, really large territories. The famous monograph by James Tanner, the one sort of comprehensive piece of information we have about this bird, found that in suitable habitat, a single ivory-billed woodpecker territory would hold 6 pileated woodpecker territories. So they needed several square miles of suitable habitat to be able to engage in their full life cycle. The damming of the Mississippi River, extensive logging throughout the southeast, changes in these ecosystems, development around these around the rivers with levees going up and protecting homesteads and farms from flooding. All of this negatively impacted this dynamic ecosystem and led to dwindling numbers of the ivory-billed woodpecker. And they finally, there was a remaining site in Louisiana called the Singer Tract, where they persisted until World War II. And eventually that tract fell to make tea crates for shipping goods over for World War II. And there are some really great articles, sad articles documenting sort of the end of these birds. at least the last known ones to be really fully documented in the wild. Okay, so that's a little bit about the ivory-billed woodpecker, and a magnificent bird. Even though it officially was last sighted in the 1930s, 1940s, there were sightings up through the 1980s that were compelling. People found interesting. Now, for every sighting that seems to have some real evidence to it, there are hundreds of sightings of pileated woodpeckers that people think are ivory bills, and so it's a challenging situation because pileated woodpeckers themselves are really impressive birds. It's really hard to convince somebody who sees a pileated and isn't sure that that's what that is, that it's not an ivory bill. But there have been sightings over the years that were compelling. And so as you're reading through, please read about their habitat and diet and their breeding and life cycle. And there's a whole section about evidence of persistence past 1944. And so there are a number of pieces to this story. I'm going to highlight just a few, and please read the rest. Let's see. One really interesting thing that happened in the 1970s was that the director of the Louisiana State Museum of Natural Science, which is a very large research collection, the director at that time was a famous ornithologist named George Lowry. And he was given two photos that were taken by a landowner of a bird that they thought was the ivory-billed woodpecker. And it was taken in the Atchafalaya Basin. The Atchafalaya is a drainage just to the west of the Mississippi River. It's one of the largest watersheds in the United States after the Mississippi, and it is a potential place. It has suitable habitat, and back then it certainly had suitable habitat. The photos seem to portray the two ivory-bills, and they seem to be consistent with the correct identification. Lowry brought these photos to the professional meeting, the American Ornithologists Union meeting in 1971. And as it says here, it was determined their quality was not sufficient for other ornithologists to be confident that they did not depict a mounted specimen. And they were greeted with general skepticism. And the real truth to that story, I know some folks that know a little more about that story, is that that sentence is a bit mild. Lowry was laughed at and scoffed at when he brought these photos to the conference. People said, "Don't you know that those, can't you tell that those are mounted specimens?" They treated him like he was not very smart, that he didn't know he was being duped. And he really worried that his reputation as a scientist would never be the same after that. So he filed those images away and never mentioned them again. Okay, and so this is the kind, even though science, the scrutiny in science is a very important part of the scientific process, it can in some cases suppress information that should maybe be treated with a little more open-mindedness, I think, in this case with Lowry. And Lowry did not present himself as somebody who was fully convinced that ivory-bills existed. So they didn't really take his entire body of work into context when they started scoffing at the pictures that he brought. In 1999, there was a forestry and wildlife student at Louisiana State University who saw some birds at close range. He didn't know what ivory-billed woodpeckers look like. He didn't have a field guide. He was turkey hunting, and he saw something interesting. And he told his advisor in the Fish and Wildlife Department, who immediately asked him to go be interviewed by the person that vets the sightings in Louisiana, a person named Van Rimpson, who was my PhD advisor. And Van gave him an interview and was very not impressed, but very intrigued by the student's, what the student noticed, because the student hadn't seen images of the bird. He was able to describe things about the bird that actually aren't even depicted in any artwork, but are described in certain descriptions of the ivory-billed. So people started to look in this area where the student had been, and then in 2001, there was a more intensive search in the Pearl River Basin for the ivory-billed woodpecker. I was one, and it's mentioned here. There were 6 researchers that spent 30 days searching in the area. I was one of the people, one of the 6 researchers. And we had, we observed some interesting woodpecker sign, and some interesting cavities that seemed more consistent with something different than a pileated, larger than a pileated. And we also heard some sounds that were later determined by a team at Cornell to not be ivory-billed woodpecker sounds. About halfway through our search, a team from Cornell did come and deployed autonomous recording units. And there was an attitude in that Cornell team that was, I had considered a bit dismissive of the people that they were working with. So that's something else that's not captured in this writing. I think they were very serious about correctly documenting the woodpecker, but the way that they interacted with other people on the search was, I didn't think entirely considerate. So a few years later, the woodpecker was officially rediscovered in Arkansas by a team led by Cornell, by a lot of the same people that came down to Louisiana for this search. And this finding was published in an issue of the journal, I believe it was Science. Yes, I couldn't remember if it was Science or Nature. So that's why I'm scrolling back. And it was, a recovery plan was not long after launched, and as was protection of a very large area of very nice riparian bottomland forest in Arkansas. There ensued a controversy between some very prominent ornithologists over the quality of the data in those sightings. And ever since that time, so over time, there was some modeling and some analysis over the years after 2005, after the publication of that paper. And it's sort of been determined that if the bird had been there, it's not there anymore. Although there continue to be these sightings, people documenting information and looking for this bird in a variety of areas in the Southeast, including some leading scientists. And so the controversy or the interest in this bird continues. The piece of it that I think is interesting about issues in ornithology is that the images that, for example, Lowry brought that were determined to be maybe mounted birds, the quality of those images actually was much higher quality than the video and image data presented by Cornell. Cornell also had some sound recordings that seemed compelling, but they were also not quality enough to be definitive. And so that's where a lot of the arguments are over this. But something that I think is a bit interesting is that because Cornell are the experts on birds, their sightings were published in the journal Science. And if that had been another team of researchers with less of an amazing reputation, that work would have definitely not been published in Science. Now, the correct, what I think of is the positive or the very necessary process of scrutiny and the back and forth, the discourse between researchers that did not find that evidence adequate and the Cornell team is the way that science is supposed to work. But the piece that I think is unique is the relationship between known researchers with associated institutions and reputations that provide them access to high impact journals in a way that teams that might have collected the same information in the same way would not have had access to. So that's kind of an interesting piece of these issues in science, and it involves birds, including a very interesting bird. And there's a lot of information to read about this bird if people are interested. All right, that's it.